Hello, Kate from FerretTube TV here. It is my great pleasure to introduce you to today's book launch. And it is, if I can just part my ferrets, and I can tell you, Mark P Henderson. And his book is called Elusive Folktales of the Peak District. It is in the genre of folktales, which makes sense given the title. And here's some ferret-related blurb for you. Mark P Henderson's Elusive Folktales of the Peak District has clearly been a labour of love, developed by someone with a passion for exploring all aspects of the environment in which they live. A journey of gasps and laughs, an exploration and hidden surprises, of sneaky crimes, I see the ferret there, and unexpected gems. Am I talking about the life of a ferret mama? Or Mark P Henderson's new book? Hard to say. I thoroughly agree with all of that. I hope you enjoyed today's book launch.
Mark P Henderson, Elusive Folktales of the Peak District. We've been publishing Mark P Henderson's fiction for several years. He originally came to us as an already published writer of many years' standing. I knew he had published a volume of Peak District tales some years ago. I grew up within reach of the Derbyshire Peak District and spent many a happy hour exploring the hills as a child, so when Mark approached us to ask if we would be interested in publishing a follow-on with even more of his Peak District tales, I essentially snatched his hand off. It's an amazing collection, illustrated with his own photos. He also took the photograph we used on the cover. And I love to think I've done my small bit too towards keeping these old tales circulating.
Hello, I'm Mark Henderson. I'm here to talk about my Elusive Folktales of the Peak, which will be released by FBP this autumn. I'm very grateful to FBP for helping this little collection to see the light of day. I'll tell you something about it and tell one or two examples of the stories. But let me backtrack to begin with. How did I get into telling Peak District stories? As you see, I'm wearing my Peak District t-shirt. Got to promote things here. Yes, well, when I moved back to, I was born in the Peak District, and after my varied career around the world, I came back to live here in 2002, and I very soon joined a local storytelling group. Discovered that they didn't have among their tellers any local stories, any stories from the Peak District. I knew there were some because I'd heard them when I was a teenager. So I went out to start collecting them. I collected from, well, other published collections. I collected from around the villages, just listening to people. I read old manuscripts and forgotten documents in local studies libraries. And I listened to other storytellers, picking up different versions of traditional tales from around the area. And then to learn to tell them properly, I went to various storytelling workshops. This enterprise culminated after quite a number of years in the publication of this work by Amberley in Stroud, Folktales of the Peak District. It contains my versions of 62 traditional tales from all around the Peak District. Now, why should I be so interested in the Peak District? Well, I was born there and I live there, and it's very beautiful. It's also very varied. It has varied landscapes. It covers 5 counties. The bulk of it is in Derbyshire, but there are also bits in southwest Yorkshire, the eastern or northeastern extremes of Greater Manchester, East Cheshire, North Staffordshire. And with that variety of landscapes, you find a variety of people. You find a variety of flora and fauna. Up on the moors, you get bog cotton and heather. You get flowers such as lousewort and milkwort, and you get golden plover, and of course the inevitable red grouse. In the lower parts of the country, particularly in the limestone area, the White Peak, you have well, a different way of farming for a start. You have the river valleys and you get the woodlands, and you get flowers such as, well, apart from the inevitable forget-me-nots and bluebells and so forth, you have some relative rarities such as sundew and butterwort and eyebright, and later in the year, real rarities such as Nottingham catchfly. All this adds to the great beauty of the Peak District and its variety of beauty, and with that variety goes a variety of stories, some of which are related to local folklore and later traditions. The best known tradition in the Peak District is well dressing. Now, well dressing involves taking a flat bed of clay free of lumps and embedding in it flower petals, leaves, pieces of bark, pieces of moss, and so forth, even little scraps of wool, in order to construct a picture. And those pictures are used to place on the village well or wells, really to celebrate the supply of water. It began in the Peak District village of Tissington. It's down in the south or southeastern part of the Peak District, not very far from the town of Ashbourne. And the real history is that during the Black Death, 1348-49, when half the population or thereabouts was wiped out, in 1347, Derbyshire had 100 priests. In the end of 1349, it had 23. 77 had died in the plague. In Tissington, no one died, and the villagers attributed this preservation to the purity of their well water, and in order to celebrate this and express their thanks, they, as they put it, revived the ancient ceremony of dressing the wells with flowers. That is supposed to be the history. I won't tell the whole folk tale. It is in here under the title The Widow and the Hob. A hob is a kind of fairy, not unique to the Peak District, but known over the north of England. It's the same sort of creature as the German kobold and the Scottish brownie. It is a habitué of woodlands, but it also can live in houses. And if you get a hob living in a house, it's wonderful. Treat them right, treat the hob correctly, leave the necessary bowl of porridge and pot of ale in the hearth overnight, and the hob will be happy, and it will light your fire and clean the house and even help in the garden or on the land. I want one. Never been able to catch one myself. Anyway, the story goes that when the new squire came to Tissington Hall and found a servant putting out the porridge and the ale into the hearth overnight, he lost his temper, and he swallowed the ale, threw the porridge in the fire, and kicked the servant out. And the hob, who had looked after the hall and the land so well, disappeared. And the weather turned foul, and the roads flooded, and the rivers flooded, and crops wouldn't grow, and animals were starving, and people were beginning to starve. And the old widow who lived on top of the hill could not understand why everything was so bad until the local farmer who bought taffs for her said that it was because the hob of the hearth had been thrown out of the Tissington Hall. And when the widow heard in the wind and the rain overnight and the banging of the shutters and the thrashing of the rain on her thatch, the crying voice, the rain do fall and the wind do blow, and what shall I do, and where should I go for me? Oh, some poor souls lost outside in this weather. And she opened the door and said, I don't know who you are, but you can come in and have some shelter. I've naught to eat, and my fire won't go because of the wet, but you're welcome. And there was no reply. She closed the door, she went to bed, and it was all damp and she was cold. She managed to sleep a little, but good heavens, when she woke up in the morning, the fire was burning, there was water boiling, there was a smell of oat cakes cooking, and she realised that the hob from the hall had come to her cottage. Now, that year, the well water, which she, of course, used from her garden, tasted sweeter than ever. She would brew ale with it, and of course use it for her own cooking. And she thought, oh, that hob, you know, he's been nice to the spirit of the well. And so it proved, because when she went out with some flowers, when the weather had improved and flowers were growing again, to say thank you to the spirit of the well, she found that the hob had done something very strange. It had taken the flowers and pulled them all to pieces. And with those pieces, it had made a picture in a bed of clay. And it was a picture of her cottage with the smoke coming out of the little chimney made of sheep's wool. And the hills in the background and the trees. Well, when she called the people of the village to see what had happened and realised that this was what the hob had done, they said, well, that's wonderful, and now we're going to make pictures like that to decorate our wells. And that, very briefly, I'm not telling the whole story today, that very briefly is how the tradition of well dressing is said to have begun. Now, hobs are one type of fairy folk, and there are lots of stories about hobs. Usually they're benevolent creatures, but not always. If you get on the wrong side of a hob, it can do quite nasty things to you. Stop the milk churning and stop the crops growing and stop your kettle boiling even. And of course, sometimes hobs will steal babies and put changelings in their place. But they're not the only type of a fairy. There are some quite malevolent ones. Also down in the south of the Peak District, not on the east side where Tessington is, but over towards the west, with that row of hills called the Roaches. It just comes from the French roche, because there's a lot of rock climbing goes on there. It's quite dramatic looking. There are one or two fairies that you really don't want to tangle with. There was a young woman who lived at Roach End Farm many, many years ago. A Roach End Farm at that time, very small and very poor. They had 2 cows and a few sheep and a few chickens. And one day the girl went to the market in Leek, which is a long walk away. And she looked at the fruit in the fruit stall and thought she would love to be able to afford one of those little gorgeous, juicy, rosy apples, but could she afford it? Did she have enough pennies in her pocket? And as she was contemplating this, she saw a little man rush in, grab an apple and run away with it. So he called a stallholder and said, "A thief! God, it's just stolen that." So she and the stallholder chased this little thief through the crowd, but the crowd was closed in and the thief disappeared. The stallholder shook his head. "Them fairy folk, they're always doing it. Always come in and steal it. Listen, thanks for trying. It was good of you to tell me. Here." And as a reward for her help, such as it was, he gave her the apple she'd been wanting. Well, of course, she went home delighted, eating the apple. But on the way home, just as she got through the village of Meerbrook, out in front of her stepped the little fellow who had stolen the apple. And he said, "You tried to get to be caught and punished. So now it's your turn to be punished. Decide which part of your body you would like to lose the use of. An arm, a leg, a foot. Well, she thought this was a joke, so she laughed and said, "Oh, well, I'll use my little fingers then. I don't know what use they are in the first place." And the little fellow said, "Then so be it." And he disappeared. The girl went home, and when she arrived, her father, tired after a long day, said, "Go on, lass, go milk them cows." So out she went to the barn to milk the 2 cows, and she couldn't, because without functional little fingers, you can't milk a cow at all effectively. And she could never milk a cow again for the rest of her life. Yes, there are all sorts of other creatures of this sort. Water spirits, I mentioned the water spirits. All the wells in the White Peak and elsewhere too have their spirits, which need to be thanked for their help, placated in times of drought. And that's what well dressing ceremony is all about, of course. There are other strange water creatures as well. The Peak District is well inland, as you probably know. It is home to 3 mermaids. Now, I'm not going to tell the mermaid stories here. They're all in Folktales of the Peak District. I haven't put any mermaid stories into Elusive Tales, the book that FBP is bringing out this autumn. But the mermaid waters are on the high ground, the dark, rough areas of the Peak District, cold, bleak, forbidding. And one of them, Lake Mere on Morridge, which is in the northern Staffordshire bit of the Peak District, is associated with a poem which goes, "She calls on you to greet her, foaming her dripping crown, but if you go to meet her, she up and drags you down." It is said that quite a lot of young men have been lured into the water of Lake Mere by the mermaid and haven't been seen again. There are other spirits, as well as the water spirits, the benevolent ones and the nasty ones. The spirits of the road. Roads, of course, were very dangerous places around the Peak District. People got lost on them, and people died out of the storms and the winter snow. And the people whose job it was to travel over those roads, the packmen, the jaggers, the haulage companies of their day, they carried all sorts of goods from one place to the other, and carried news as well. Always treated with suspicion because they seemed to belong to the hills rather than to any particular parish. But they had their own superstitions too, and they used to say thank you to the spirits of the road. Now, early in the 18th century, John Turner of Saltersford, now there's a name for you, isn't it? Saltersford. It's in the hilly bit of East Cheshire. No, Cheshire isn't entirely flat. You go to the Peak District end and it's very hilly. Saltersford is on one of the ancient pack routes. It's a metalled road now, lane, should I say. And you can tell that it's what one type of goods that was carried along that road was salt. And Saltersford Hall is near a bridge over a little stream. It used to be a ford, yeah, so Saltersford's pretty obvious name. Now, John Turner was born there in 1702, and he watched the packmen going past with their salt and other goods, going way down into Derbyshire and across to Yorkshire. And coming back with all sorts of lead and coal and grain for the breweries. And he thought, that's what I want to do when I come of age. And when he came of age with the little money he'd got, age 21, he bought 4 pack horses and set himself up as a jagger. And he too was carrying salt from the salt mines of Cheshire down into Derbyshire, and coming back from Derby and its surroundings with grain for the Cheshire breweries. Now, he was an enlightened young man, and he rather scorned the old jaggers for leaving little offerings of food and flowers beside the road to placate the spirits. Oh, they told him, you need to look after the spirits of the road, and then they'll look after you. Nonsense, thought John. He knew the roads, he knew the hills, he was not afraid of the weather. He could look after himself. He was a fit, agile young man. He was also a good businessman. Oh no, said the packmen. Don't ignore the spirits of the road, because if you give them gifts, they will protect your footsteps. But if you don't, they might do the opposite. 1733, Christmas Eve, great snowstorm. Blizzard had whitened the whole land. That didn't worry John Turner. He could find his way through all that heavy snow with his 4 pack horses, and he was coming back to Saltersford to have Christmas with his family. He didn't arrive. He was found the next day, dead in the snow. His pack horses survived. They were half buried in the snowdrift, but they were fine. There is a little memorial memorial stone placed where John Turner's body was found. And at the back of it reads, the footprint of a woman's shoe was found beside him in the snow where he lay dead. Not a good idea to ignore the spirits of the road. Anyway, that is the story of John Turner. That's I've put in Elusive Tales, so you can read the full version of it there and see my photographs of the John Turner Memorial Stone with that inscription. There are some horrid stories as well. Oh my goodness, there's some gory ones, and children love them. Down in Gradbach, Gradbach, yes, it's hardly a place now. It's a location on a map. If you drive down the A53 road from Buxton towards Leek, you pass through the highest village in the UK, Flash. It's near Three Shires Head, where Derbyshire, Cheshire and Staffordshire all meet. When I say the highest village in the UK, I do mean altitude. I'm not trying to suggest that the good people of Flash indulge communally in recreational substances. Anyway, Gradbach is just down the hill from Flash. There was once a peddler who, weary of his travels on what was then a very rough road between Buxton and Leek, wondered where he might stay the night, because this was bleak countryside and there didn't seem to be any hostelries around. He sold the rest of his goods to two fellow travellers and asked them if they could recommend an inn. He didn't quite like the way they exchanged glances and inspected each other, but they said, "Oh, they see, go down that hill from Flash, get down to river, follow river, and they'll come to inn at Gradbach. They'll look after you." So the peddler thanked them, and off he went. And he slipped and slid, and he got cold, and he got miserable, and the night got darker and darker, he was so relieved to see the inn. The lights blazing, the wood smoke coming from the chimney. The door was closed, which was strange, but when he knocked at it, the landlord welcomed him in and sat him beside the fire and brought him some ale. And there, in front of that lovely big log fire, with the ale in his hand, the pedlar began to doze. He became aware that a bloodhound had come to sit beside his chair on this side. And when he looked, there was another bloodhound on the other side, staring, looking up at him. Oh, it's all right. The dogs weren't doing him any harm. He gradually dozed and got closer, closer to sleep. There was a funny smell in the place, which he couldn't quite place. And there were no other customers. Well, it's a pretty isolated inn, and maybe the other people from farms around would come in later. Then he heard the kitchen door open. And small footsteps came up to him, and this girl's voice said, "Oh, he's got lovely plump hands. They'll make delicious pies." At which the kitchen door burst open again. Somebody came out and grabbed the child and dragged it back into the kitchen. The pedlar woke up and decided that, weary though he was, he really didn't want to stay in this inn overnight. Very quietly, he set down his mug bale and he stood up and motioning to the bloodhounds to be quiet, backed away to the door, just be hoping the hinges wouldn't creak when he let himself out. He stepped out of the inn and he fled, following the river. And of course, he'd been heard. Very soon there was the cry of the landlord and his family and the bloodhounds chasing him. And he thought, I can't possibly get out of this. Them hounds can smell me. I'll have to go in the river. And he went into the water and finally found a bridge, which is called Caster's Bridge. And he hid under it in the black shadow of the moonlight. And the hunt came closer and closer, and the hounds were baying, and the landlord was shouting, and all the landlord's family was shouting. And then they went past. The pedlar thought, dare I get out? Dare I go? Finally, he thought, well, they'll come back. They'll come back. I've got to go. He leapt out of the water, freezing cold, dripping wet, ran across the bridge till he came to the nearest village, which of course by then was all in darkness, and shouted, help me, they're trying to eat me. Well, as he shouted and shouted, a candle was lit over here, and another candle was lit over here. And as the lights came on in the windows, doors opened and people came out and said, who are you? What are you shouting about at this time of night? Pedlar told his story, and one of the villagers said, it's that place at Gradbatch. There's folk gone there and haven't been heard of again. And the second villager said, aye, something ought to be done about it, you know. And the third villager said, well, now we've heard this pedlar story, I think we ought to go and do it, don't you? The men of the village agreed, and they collected scythes and pitchforks and ropes and matches, and off they went to the inn at Gradbatch, while two of the women in the village took the poor pedlar indoors and fed him and got him warm and gave him a bed for the night. Well, when the villagers got to the inn at Gradbatch, the landlord and his family had returned. The villagers searched the place. They found the belongings of people who disappeared. And in the kitchen, they found great cooking vats with human bones in them. They dragged the landlord and his family outside, and using the ropes they had brought, they hanged them from the nearest trees. And then they set fire to the inn and burnt it down. But of course, the little girl, who could blame the little girl for all the wickedness of her family? she sneaked away unnoticed through the woods and out onto the moors, knowing that soon she would meet a nice, kind adult to look after her. A nice, plump adult. The story of the Gradbatch cannibals is there in Elusive Tales. Well, not all the stories are horrible, and not all of them are stories of fairy folk and other spirits. There was, this is right from the north of the Peak District, Saddleworth. There was a story involving a businessman from London. He specialised in agricultural machinery. He got a message saying that his aunt had died. It's his aunt who lived in Saddleworth, and he'd never met her, so he was hardly likely to feel bereaved. But he thought, she might have left me something in her will. And sure enough, he got a letter from her solicitor saying that he was, in fact, a beneficiary of his aunt's will. So he thought, right, well, I'm not sure where Saddleworth is, but I'm sure I'll find it. Next time I'm somewhere up north, I'll go across there and see what's to be found. Well, as it happened, a couple of weeks later, he had a business meeting in Sheffield. So having been there, he drove over the Pennines to Saddleworth and found his aunt's lawyer and discovered that indeed he had been left a legacy. Her donkey. A donkey isn't a great deal of use in the City of London. Well, I'd better have a look at it anyway. So the lawyer took him to on the donkey. It was an old thing. It was old, and it was half blind. It was a bit lame, and his ears drooped, and it was pretty moth-eaten. And that. How much do you think I might get for that? The businessman, £50 if you're lucky. So the businessman put the donkey on up for sale for £50, and people came up to him and said, no chance, one after the other. And then an old hill farmer, Saddleworth Hill Farm yard, big man, big strong fellow, with clever eyes, flat hat, black vowels. 50 quid. Aye, all right, I'll take it. So at last, well, £50, gracious me, it was hardly worth the trip over the Pennines, the time he'd taken, but at least it was better than nothing, and he was no longer saddled with a sad Saddleworth donkey. So home he went with the £50 in his pocket and thought no more about it until he received a message 3 weeks later to tell him that the donkey had died, whereupon he was highly amused. Oh my goodness, that old farmer was such a fool. £50 for a dead donkey. Dear me. 4 months later, at an agricultural show in the Midlands, the businessman was doing all sorts of deals when he saw that same big Saddleworth farmer among the crowd. Well, he better keep a low profile. He's a big fellow, and he's not going to be happy about the donkey. Oh dear, no, he was spotted. Hey lad, I want a word with you. Oh yes, I remember you. Hey, that donkey, I thought, well, I'd got a right good deal out of that. What? I heard the donkey had died. Oh, I died. What was? I raffled it. You raffled a dead donkey? Well, tell you what, dead. I raffled a donkey. Raffle ticket. £2.50 a ticket. £2 a ticket. See, £2 a ticket. Prize one donkey. Oh, I sold 250 tickets. You get £500 minus the 50 you pay. You made £450 on a dead donkey. No, it weren't quite that much, son. See, raffle tickets cost me a tenner. So £440 profit. Well, again, son, it weren't quite that much. See, blokers won't raffle. Oh, He weren't happy when he found out Donkey were dead. I had to give him his £2 back. Well, there's another one that's in the Elusive Tales of the Peak District. You'll find some illustrations as well. I think my photo, a sketch map to show where of the Peak District, to show where the stories were set, and a whole lot of photographs that I had fun collecting. Well, sometimes it wasn't much fun. One of the Saddleworth stories, I had to go and climb hills up onto Saddleworth Moors. It was a freezing cold day, and trying to use a camera. Yeah. Anyway, I got it. I sorted that out. I went to film the scene for the Grad Batch Cannibals. The old Cassius Mill is gone. It's just a modern bridge with wrought iron rails now, which isn't quite so impressive, but still I photographed it. We made some films of some of those stories from the Peak District, from the south part of the Peak District as well. I got a reference to the films. You can get them on the Peak in the Past website, www.peakinthepast.com. Go to that and scroll down to Folktales, and you'll get the recordings that I made in situ with a very good cameraman, Dave the cameraman, who told me how to do films, which I'd never done before. That I'll never forget recording the Grand Batch Cannibals. For the last bit of it, we went to an old tumbled down shack, which was to serve as the mill, and I had a lantern in my hand. And we recorded the last bit of the tale there. And those last 4 words that I put into the version I've just told you, nice, hello. Sorry, can we just record those last 4 words again? There was a plane in the distance, and I picked the sound up. The next recording, the wind caught the microphone. The next, there was a motorbike going past. The next, there was some animal noise. And we did 13 takes of the last 4 words. Oh, I wouldn't forget that. Anyway, the references, the link to those films are in the introduction to Elusive Tales of the Peak District. It's one of a number of books that are being released by Fantastic Books Publishing this autumn. I'm looking forward to a number of my fellow authors, Walt Pilcher, Sue Knight, Stuart Aiken, and others. They've all got new books out there, and I'm really looking forward to a chance to read them. And well, I can only recommend that you do likewise. I can recommend those authors strongly. They write very well, and I'm happy to be, as it were, among their number. Well, that's enough from me.
When my friend and fellow author Mark Henderson found out I was doing a video review of his new book, Elusive Tales of the Peak District, he begged me not to do it. "This is a serious book," he said, "and I'm afraid you'll turn the review into a comedy act like you do with almost everything else." Well, I did my best to reassure Mark and promised I would treat his work with the respect it deserves, and also mention he's the author of a number of other excellent books as well, and that his command and usage of the English language is uniquely masterful and awe-inspiring, all of which is true. I've read several of his other books. I've also read Elusive Tales of the Peak District, and I liked it a lot. Besides, being from the UK, Mark has a sophisticated, authoritative British accent, so he sounds serious and erudite every time he opens his mouth. And it's reflected in his writing, too. All of that, of course, just naturally commands respect. Furthermore, because Elusive Tales of the Peak District is the follow-on to Mark's Folk Tales of the Peak District, I can honestly say in my review that he knows whereof he speaks or writes. Anyway, I think my words had a calming effect on him because after a while he stopped returning my calls and emails. So let's get to it. Here's the problem. This is one of those rare books whose title tells us exactly what's in the book. So after I enjoyed the beautifully scenic cover, opened the book, got through the legal mumbo jumbo, the foreword and a map of the Peak District in north central England, the rest of the book was only blank pages. Talk about elusive. Apparently, the folk tales in question are so elusive, old Mark can't find them. At the end of the book, there is a page with Mark's biographical information and an impressive list of his other works, but before that, nothing. Well, of course, I'm joking. The stories are there, all right. 36 of them, complete with commentary on each one and photographs like these, many of the locations where the stories supposedly took place. And I liked all the stories. Mark explains why they're elusive. And here he is. Well, here's his picture. I'll read what he says. The previous book, Folk Tales of the Peak District, contained no examples of stories from the far north of the peak and only 4 from the southwest portion, says Mark. This new volume makes good those omissions and presents alternative versions and commentaries on a few items in the earlier collection. Some are quite well known, but others are obscure and are seldom, if ever, told. Hence the title of this anthology. So, why did I like them? Well, first of all, they're good stories. Interesting, engaging, often with a moral. Secondly, they give insight not only to the human character, the good, the bad, the fantastic, the tragic, the funny, but also to the British character. Now, why should an American care about all that? Well, why should an American read Shakespeare or Dickens or Conan Doyle or Kipling or enjoy the music of George Frederick Handel, even though he was born in Germany? It's because it's excellent stuff. You can enjoy it and you can learn from it. Also, in my case, my ancestors were English, so this is a little bit like rediscovering my roots. Here are just a few of the tantalizing titles. The Businessman, the Farmer, and the Donkey. You know, an Americanized version of this one has made the rounds on Facebook under the rubric of Don't Mess with Country Folks. The Farmer and the Devil, The Carpenter and the Frog, The Dying Mill Worker. That one made me laugh out loud, but I won't spoil it for you. The Sheldon Duck Tree, very interesting situation. The Grodbach Cannibals, Ghosts of Butterton, The Headless Horseman of Oncote, I think I'm pronouncing that correctly, and The Phantom Coach of Throwley Hall. Hope I'm pronouncing that one right too. Now, Mark writes these old folk tales with all the drama he can muster, much like the way he tells them in person in storytelling gatherings or on YouTube, where he actually goes on location, and that adds realism and a sense of currency to the narration. Now, here's a short clip from Mark's telling of one of the stories, the Grodbach Cannibals. It's a short clip, not enough to spoil it for you. And here it is.
He woke, and as he did so, someone stepped out of the kitchen and seized the little girl and pulled her back in there. And he thought, I've got to get out of here. He moved very quietly. But as he moved towards the door, he saw that one of the bloodhounds had stood and was watching him, and then the other bloodhound stood and was watching him. He felt for the door. He felt for the latch. He could only hope that when he opened the door, the hinges wouldn't creak. He pushed the door wide and he stepped through. And then he ran.
I assure you, the writing is every bit as dramatic and exciting as what you just saw and heard. As Mark himself explains in the foreword, a written collection of folk tales is like a collection of butterflies. To be what they truly are, butterflies and oral stories have to fly. That's why I've written them as I have, not in the often fragmentary or deadpan way in which I've heard or read many of them, but in a manner as close as possible to the way I tell them at storytelling gatherings. I want my readers to meet them in something close to tellable condition. And readable and tellable they are. Elusive Tales of the Peak District by Mark Henderson is easily a 5 out of 5 stars, and I think you'll agree. So don't wait, get it today. And thanks for watching.
Elusive Folktales of the Peak District by Mark P Henderson. If you're a lover of folk tales or of the Peak District, or both, then you will love this book. It's more than just a collection of folk tales. Mark Henderson does his research and he shares it. We get to know the origins of the stories, sometimes the probable origins because some of them are lost in the mists of time. And they cover a range from laugh out loud funny to truly tragic. Personally, I love the Peak District. I grew up close by. And the book is illustrated with the author's own photographs. He has clearly hiked many miles to illustrate this book. He brings out the majestic landscape of the Peak District in both the pictures and the stories, but he also brings out the dark side. Beautiful it undoubtedly is, but bad things have happened there, and these folk tales mirror the area's checkered history. I love to read about the Peak District, and I knew that Mark Henderson would have done a good job of researching it. But a book of folk tales is not my normal choice of reading matter, so I confess I didn't expect to enjoy this book as much as I did. However, the first tale had me laughing out loud, and from there I was hooked. And I loved the photographs, and it was made extra special that I knew some of the places through all those childhood visits. There's also a sketch map, which makes it easy to locate the tales and where they come from. It's a book that's both entertaining and informative. Mark Henderson has woven together history, myth and folklore and created something truly special. If you love folk tales, the Peak District, or just a good story, don't miss this one. That's Elusive Folktales of the Peak District by Mark P Henderson.